I know the new Fed Chairman, Ben Bernanke, for about 2 decades or more now. We came to know each other gradually, imperceptibly, because we were both working in the same fields of economics, money and banking, and their application to monetary policy. And then in the 1990s, this idea of inflation targeting, which I'll talk about in a little more detail later, was born. And Ben and I both were working on this idea in parallel. I was then working within the Federal Reserve System. And one of the things that I did was to have my president, the president of the Richmond Federal Reserve Bank, talk about inflation targeting for the first time in the Federal Open Market Committee in 1994. I remember the year because it was the first time that concept had ever been discussed. And meanwhile, I think Ben began to write about inflation targeting sometime around the mid-1990s. And so he was on the outside working then at Princeton. And so we had parallel paths working on the idea inside the Fed and outside the Fed. And so I got even friendlier at that point with Ben when we realized we were working on the same kind of concept for strategy for monetary policy. And finally, Ben actually came to the Federal Reserve System sometime, I think, in year 2002, became a member of the Federal Reserve Board, and then I saw him at open market meetings. I had been going to these meetings as an advisor to my president for over a decade. It's very simple. It means that the Federal Reserve or any central bank should put a priority on maintaining low and stable inflation. And it should do so with procedures that are relatively transparent and by making its target for inflation explicit, so that in the case of the Federal Reserve, people think that the Federal Reserve ought to announce an explicit target for core PCE inflation, which is a particular measure of the inflation rate that the Fed favors, of between 1% and 2% on a long-run basis, and that should be the strategic anchor for monetary policy. Those of us who think that this is a good idea also think that it would not only stabilize inflation, but it would go a long way to stabilizing employment and economic growth. There has been a lot of discussion about whether it's good enough to have the Fed follow an implicit inflation targeting strategy, or whether the Fed needs to be more explicit about its inflation target. And there are two famous protagonists on either side of this debate. Alan Greenspan, who has implicitly stabilized inflation over his tenure at the Federal Reserve, is very much against explicit statement of an inflation targeting, of inflation target, while Ben Bernanke very much believes the Fed needs to be explicit about its inflation target and that it would not be a good idea to remain implicit about it. And there's been a big debate about this in the press between these two people. I should admit that I'm very much on the side of being explicit, and I would put the arguments first for explicitness this way. I think that the Federal Reserve ought to take the opportunity to lock in on an indefinite basis its inflation performance by acknowledging that it has an implicit target, and it would like to see the inflation rate, in fact, remain between 1% and 2% as measured by the core PCE on an indefinite basis, and that there is virtually no reason why any Federal Reserve official would like to see inflation be much higher or much lower than that ever. And I think that's a fair statement, and given that that's true, why not set an explicit inflation targeting range, which would be a long-run range, by the way. It doesn't say that the Federal Reserve would try to act in the very, very short run to stabilize inflation within that range if a shock pushed it outside. It's a statement that says that over the long run, on average, the Fed would not like to see inflation be higher than 2% or lower than 1%. Well, I'll go to the other side first, and I'll come back to my own side again, so as not to be too favored in this. On the other side, Alan Greenspan has argued we've been just doing it, and we don't need to be explicit about this. Alan Greenspan thinks that if the Fed is committed to doing it kind of implicitly, that there's no reason to tie its hands by stating an upper bound explicitly or a lower bound. I think the main argument on that score is that it doesn't buy you much to just write down something. In other words, what matters more to people on that side of the debate is what the Fed does, not what it says. And actually, this is this issue with regard to inflation targeting is very much something that cuts across policymaking in Washington in general. A lot of people think it matters more what people do and less what people say they're going to do. This is just one example of that kind of debate, which just rages across all areas of policy and government. If I can come back to the other side, I will say that I think people like myself and Ben, who are maybe children of the 1960s, we favor more explicitness as a way to pin down and discipline government against actions that they might take which are not beneficial. We don't think that the Federal Reserve is likely to depart from inflation stability, but we see no reason why the Fed shouldn't be disciplined by an explicit announcement of a target not to do so. We would say there's very little to lose by doing that and potentially something to gain. So really this is a very subtle debate that goes on between Alan Greenspan and Ben Bernanke. Not really. I mean, Ben has been very careful to say that while he favors this and he's happy to promote explicit inflation targeting, Ben has been very careful to say that he doesn't intend to try to force this on people, that he intends to persuade people, first in the Federal Open Market Committee, and then in the Congress, and then in the public at large and in the markets. And knowing Ben, that's exactly what he's likely to do. He's a smart person who figures out where he wants to stand on his best judgment, and then is very good at persuading people what needs to be done. He was chairman of the economics department at Princeton, did a good job of running the department on the basis of persuasion, and I think that's what he's going to do in this case. But I don't think he's going to move quickly on this point. And I should say there's no real need to move quickly because we're inheriting from Alan Greenspan's tenure very stable inflation expectations and stable inflation. So Ben has got a period of time where there's no real need to move to an explicit target. How do I think that Alan Greenspan's management of the Federal Reserve, in particular monetary policy at the Federal Reserve, will differ from the way Ben Bernanke manages the Federal Reserve and monetary policy? I think that they will differ on another very important dimension. Alan Greenspan is a famous business economist. Alan Greenspan's career began as a business economist when the federal government first began to collect macroeconomic data comprehensively in, I think, 1946 or 1947 as a result of what we call the Employment Act. And Alan Greenspan was a young person, and he said, this is a nice career for me. I like statistics. I'm going to follow these statistics, and I'm going to sell my services about how to read the economy statistics to people that run corporations. Alan Greenspan essentially invented the business economist industry. Ben Bernanke, on the other hand, approaches monetary policy as an academic, somebody who thinks about models, that explain how the world works in a mechanical way. There are two very different approaches to monetary policy. One is data-driven, heavily data-driven, and the other is heavily theoretically driven and model-driven. They're not completely independent of each other because both use a little bit of each other's reasoning. But there is a substantial difference in the inclination to approach monetary policy by looking at data first and then looking at models, or by looking at models first and then looking at data. Yeah. Ben Bernanke, by being more comfortable with the way the world works, and he's more comfortable with setting an explicit inflation target because his understanding of the mechanics of how that would work in practice, even though that hasn't been done. He's trained as an economist using models, and essentially what that allows you to do is to allow economists to imagine how the world would work if you change some policy in that world. That's really what an academic economist does. Ben, I think, and I'm speaking for myself, that's the way I think about it. And I think we're more inclined to have the Fed set an explicit target because we're more comfortable with our imagining how the world would work in that circumstance. Alan Greenspan is very much a person who's skeptical of changing policy in ways that are not absolutely necessary because it's not in the data over history. And so his natural inclination to reason by historical data and circumstance makes it a little harder for him to imagine how the world would work in circumstances that are unlike, in some ways, how the past was. So right there you can see that this subtle distinction about how you view the world colors your eagerness colors your views with regard to the inflation targeting debate. Well, if you follow the latest data, the U.S. economy is doing very well. In the last few data points that I've seen on the macroeconomy suggest the economy is doing perhaps a little bit better than even expected last December. And so I would think that the odds are that interest rates, the Federal Reserve's federal funds rate target would probably have to rise a little bit more. I haven't seen the federal funds rate futures market in which where you can read off what the market expects of future Fed funds rates, but I would be willing to bet that they've built into those forecasts some further tightening of monetary policy, given how strong the economy is at the moment. I think that the change of chairman has virtually no impact on the short-run inclinations of the Federal Open Market Committee at this point, in part because, you can go back again to what I've been emphasizing here, that since the Fed has been implicitly targeting inflation, all that Ben Bernanke wants to do is to continue to target inflation, and I think everybody recognizes that to sustain low inflation at this point, given the strength of the economy, we're almost certainly likely to need somewhat higher short-term interest rates. How active will Ben Bernanke be in the debate in Washington about non-monetary policy matters? And so one of the issues is on tax cuts, on the budget deficit, and then there's the issue of China. And it's very interesting. There is a difference here between Ben Bernanke and Alan Greenspan. Ben Bernanke went out of his way to emphasize in his confirmation hearings that he intended to stick to his knitting, so to speak, to concentrate mostly on monetary policy matters and to say much less about non-monetary matters, much less. And Alan Greenspan, on the other hand, as you know, spoke a lot about non-monetary policy matters. There is a sense in which Alan Greenspan spoke predominantly about non-monetary matters. And this gets to another big difference between the two men. And Ben Bernanke wants to narrow the scope of what he talks about, to focus on monetary policy, partly because, I think, he feels more comfortable doing that, given that the Federal Reserve is an independent agency with a particular mission. It's not completely clear that the Fed should be talking about other business that's delegated to the Congress. But also, Alan Greenspan, I think in part, was happy to talk about non-monetary matters so as to avoid having to talk about monetary matters. This might be somewhat controversial, but it fits with the idea that if you're data-driven and not model-driven, you're less inclined to talk about how you see your worldview, because your worldview is less anchored for a non-academic than it is for an academic. But what follows from all this is that Ben is anxious to be more transparent about monetary policy, anxious to talk more about monetary policy, and he doesn't have the need to talk about non-monetary policy things. And he's more anxious to talk about monetary policy because he's more comfortable with his model-driven worldview, which enables him to articulate how he thinks things work. So there's a big difference in approach and how it really affects what the leadership of the Fed is willing to talk about. So Ben Bernanke has opinions. He's an academic of long-standing interest in lots of issues. He's written textbooks. He has probably points of view on lots of things. So there's a question. I mean, somebody could dredge up a point of view that he had on natural gas and say, do you believe this today? And he has to deal with that. That's going to be a little bit tricky for him. I mean, he has a paper trail because he's an academic. I don't really know how that will work out. It'd be very interesting to see whether he says, I'm sorry, I'm unwilling to discuss that as long as I'm Fed chairman. I think that Ben is likely to be focused on monetary policy for the indefinite future until he's drawn, if at all, he's drawn into these other issues over time. Well, yes, the question is, what about the deficit? And people who are in the monetary policy business know that the Federal Reserve can only maintain low inflation as long as the deficit is managed prudently. That if the deficit is managed very poorly, eventually what might happen is the public might come to expect that some portion of that deficit is going to be monetized, that is paid for by printing money. If that happens, there's no way the Federal Reserve can anchor inflation expectations, because the public will get nervous regardless of what the Fed says. And then you have situations, if I can come back to what I talked about a minute ago, where nominal long-term interest rates will start to rise to build in inflation and premium. And then it becomes very, very hard for the Fed to do monetary policy in that situation. You have long-term interest rates rising, not because of what the Fed's doing, but because of mismanagement of fiscal policy. So this is a good question. Ben Bernanke will have to decide at some point whether or not he wants to get involved in arguing against deficits in order to preempt, so to speak, potential problems for his own job, his own mission, monetary policy mission. So one specific issue with regard to the management of the government's budget is the so-called pay-go provisions, which were in place for maybe a decade or so and were lifted in 2002. Pay-go is a situation in which Congress disciplined itself so that whenever Congress wanted to spend more money, it also had to decide at the same time how it would pay for that spending. And that makes the costs of additional spending be internalized in the spending desires themselves. And so that pay-go provision tended to keep deficits down. In fact, we had big budget surpluses in the last part of the 1990s, in part because of the pay-go provision. Okay, so what do I think Ben Bernanke is likely to say about this? Is he going to get involved in this debate? It's a very tough call. That's a very, very good question, because it, on one hand, insisting on pay-go makes sense as a natural way for Congress to discipline itself so that deficits don't become a problem. On the other hand, Fed chairman maybe doesn't want to get involved in the debates on fiscal policy because it's not his mission. But it could become a concern of his 10 or 20 years from now. So again, it's this issue of how preemptive does a Fed chairman feel he has to be on fiscal deficits in order to stabilize inflation expectations against some beliefs that the public might come to have about future monetary financing of government spending. I don't know. This is a very difficult question. I imagine that Ben has thought about it a little bit, but it's not one I would want to predict one way or the other. What are the similarities of Ben Bernanke and Alan Greenspan? They're both very collegial, very, very intelligent, very, very good economists who love nothing more than to talk about economics. And when people, I feel a little bit biased on this point myself, because what I think is so wonderful about economists is you can talk dispassionately about any public policy question in an agreed-to framework, which starts from the proposition that markets work best for the country, and you want to then ask questions like, well, why aren't markets helping in this public policy question, or how can markets be made to help in this public policy question? Both these men worldview is that the way to think about the economy and public policy is to start with the premise that markets generally work, and if there's a problem somewhere, where are markets failing and why? And if there's a problem somewhere, how can markets be made to work better? Both men have exactly that worldview, which I subscribe to. I'm teaching an undergraduate course on money banking and financial markets, and I'm teaching an MBA course, graduate MBA course on money banking and financial markets. And so the timing of Ben Bernanke's first monetary policy report to Congress was too good to pass up. I had just finished 3 or 4 weeks explaining to my classes how interest rate policy works and and basically making the case for inflation targeting. And I said, you know, Ben Bernanke he's on board with all we've been learning. And so Ben made his first speech to Congress. I was reading it for myself because I wanted to see whether he was sticking to the things that I knew he believed in. And he was. And then I kind of read the speech and I was very happy about this. And it occurred to me, why not Xerox the speech and show it to my class? First, I wanted to do it because I wanted the class to say, you know, we really know what we're talking about here. But it was very, very interesting because the class was, I think, very happy to be able to interpret what would otherwise be an unintelligible, arcane, boring economics speech if you hadn't had 3 or 4 weeks of interest rate theory and policy. And I think it worked out very well. We had a wonderful discussion. The timing was perfect. And even though I had to cut out some other things from the class to do this, it was worth it. People were very, very interested. I went through the little speech line by line, talking about which parts of the speech were filler, where the essence was, and how the essence related to what the little model we were doing and we were analyzing in class would have predicted that Ben would have said. So I say the model would have predicted Ben should say this, and we see in the speech there's a sentence about this. It's usually revolving around the importance of inflation targeting, the anchoring of inflation expectations, the fact that inflation targeting not only stabilizes inflation but stabilizes output. And what was very interesting is it took me 3 or 4 weeks to explain this to the class, and Ben did it in about 4 or 5 pages to the Congress. So we all got a kick out of how each sentence could represent, you know, an hour lecture or 2-hour lecture. The undergraduates kind of enjoyed all this, and they were very, very inquisitive, but were not inclined to disagree with much. But the MBAs did disagree with an important issue. They were not in favor of the Fed announcing an explicit, well, I'm very careful about this. They were not in favor of the Congress mandating the Fed to have an explicit inflation target. At one point after talking about Ben's monetary policy report to Congress, I said, well, class, on the basis of having seen this report and having studied monetary policy for the last month and a half, don't you think it would be a good idea if we encourage the Congress to mandate the Fed set an explicit target for inflation? And I was amazed that the class of MBAs said, first they didn't say anything. And I was unsure why they weren't responding. And then it turned out that about half of them disagreed with me. They said they acknowledged that low inflation is a good idea, and they were basically on Greenspan's side. We think the Fed is likely to continue to pursue low inflation. There's no need to set an explicit range or to have Congress mandate it. And I was joking with them, and I said, oh, you like don't ask, don't tell monetary policy. And, to their credit, the class one by one said, I guess we do. So they were basically making Alan Greenspan's case.